April 15th, 1945. We liberated a concentration camp. I saw the ovens, the bodies, the survivors who looked like skeletons. I threw up behind a building and swore I'd never forget what evil looked like. 3 months later, I was assigned to guard a POW camp for German prisoners. And I watched American soldiers do things that made me realize we weren't the good guys anymore. We'd become what we fought against. And I did nothing to stop it. My name is Frank. I'm 98 years old. I've told you about the German soldier I saved, the French girl who hid me, the 14-year-old boy I killed. Those stories were hard to tell. This one might be the hardest, because it destroys the myth we've built about World War II. The myth that we were the heroes, that we were always on the right side, that Americans could never do what the Nazis did. I'm here to tell you that's a lie. When you give people power over others, when you dehumanize the enemy enough, when you tell yourself they deserve whatever happens to them, anyone can become a monster. Even us, even Americans, even the good guys. This happened in two parts. First, the liberation, then the realization. I need to tell you both, because you can't understand the second without seeing the first. You need to understand what we witnessed, what we thought we were fighting against, and then you need to understand what we became. It was April 15th, 1945. We were pushing through Germany. The war was almost over. Hitler would be dead in 2 weeks, though we didn't know that yet. We just knew the German army was collapsing. Units surrendering left and right, towns falling without a fight. We'd been told there were camps, labor camps where the Nazis kept prisoners, political prisoners, Jews, people they considered undesirable. We'd heard rumors about what was happening in these camps, but nobody really believed it. It seemed too evil to be true, too organized, too deliberate. How could a civilized nation do something like that? Then we found Niederhausen. That wasn't its official name. It was a small sub-camp, part of a larger system. Maybe 300 prisoners? Not one of the big ones you've heard about. Not Auschwitz or Dachau. Just a small camp in the middle of nowhere that most history books don't even mention. But what we found there changed everything I thought I knew about human beings. The smell hit us first. Before we even saw the camp, we could smell it. Death, rot, human waste. It was so thick in the air you could taste it. Some of the guys started gagging immediately. The German guards had fled a few days before, just left, abandoned the prisoners and ran. When we arrived, the gates were open. Bodies were scattered around the compound. People who'd been too weak to move when liberation came, who died of starvation or disease in those final days. The ones who were still alive barely looked human. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying that's what starvation does to people. It turns them into skeletons wrapped in skin. Their eyes were sunken in, their bones visible through their bodies. They could barely stand. Some crawled toward us. Others just stared with these hollow eyes, like they couldn't believe we were real, like they thought we might be a hallucination. We called for medical support immediately, started distributing our rations, but we couldn't give them too much, too fast. Their bodies couldn't handle it. Some of the guys tried to feed them, and the prisoners got sick because their stomachs had shrunk. We had to watch people starving to death and only give them tiny amounts of food because more would kill them. The medics set up a triage area, started treating the worst cases, but there were so many, too many. I walked through the camp, trying to help. There were barracks where people had been crammed together, wooden bunks stacked 3 high with barely any space. A latrine that was just a trench. No privacy, no dignity. And then I saw the building at the back of the camp. Brick, with a chimney. I walked over to it, opened the door, and that's when I understood. It was a crematorium, not for people who died naturally, for people they killed. There were ovens, designed specifically for burning human bodies. There were still ashes inside, still bones that hadn't completely burned. On the floor there were stretchers stained with blood. On the wall there were hooks. I didn't understand what the hooks were for until one of the other soldiers told me later. They'd hang people on those hooks while they were still alive. I won't describe more than that. I can't. Even 80 years later, I can't make myself say those details out loud.
I went outside and threw up. Couldn't stop. Just kept heaving until there was nothing left in my stomach, and then I kept heaving anyway. Davies found me there, bent over, shaking. He didn't say anything, just stood there with me. When I finally stopped, I looked at him and said, "How? How do people do this?" He shook his head. "I don't know. But we're going to make sure everyone knows what they did. We're going to make sure the world sees this." And we did. We documented everything. Took photographs, took statements from survivors, made lists of names. We wanted evidence, proof of what the Nazis had done. Proof that this evil had existed, because even seeing it with our own eyes, part of us couldn't believe it. Couldn't accept that human beings had built a system designed specifically to destroy other human beings. Not in combat, not in war, but systematically, efficiently, like it was just another job. I spent 3 days at that camp. 3 days helping survivors, listening to their stories, learning what had been done to them. They told us about the medical experiments, the beatings, the starvation, the random executions. They told us about watching their families die, about children who'd been killed for crying, about old people who'd been shot because they couldn't work. They told us things I still can't repeat, things that proved the Nazis weren't just enemies. They were evil, pure evil. When we finally left that camp, I was changed. We all were. We'd seen something that broke our understanding of the world. We thought we were fighting a war, soldiers against soldiers. But this wasn't war. This was something worse. This was industrialized murder. And it made us angry, made us righteous, made us believe we were the good guys fighting absolute evil, made us believe we could never do something like that. We were Americans. We were the liberators. We were better than them. 3 months later, I learned we weren't. The war ended in May. Germany surrendered. But that didn't mean everyone went home. Millions of German soldiers were now prisoners of war. They had to be housed somewhere while the Allies figured out what to do with them. POW camps were set up all across occupied Germany. Just temporary holding facilities, places to keep prisoners until they could be processed, identified, and eventually released or tried for war crimes. I was assigned to guard duty at one of these camps, near Mannheim. It was a huge facility. Maybe 10,000 German prisoners. Former Wehrmacht soldiers mostly, some SS. They were housed in tents, given basic rations, not comfortable but not supposed to be terrible either. The Geneva Convention had rules about how you treat prisoners of war. They're supposed to get food, water, shelter, medical care. They're supposed to be treated humanely, even if they're the enemy, even if they're Nazis. That's what separates civilization from barbarism. Rules, standards, lines you don't cross. At first, things seemed okay. The prisoners were kept in their sections, guards patrolled the perimeter, everything was organized. But I started noticing things. Small things at first. Guards would accidentally drop food in the mud before giving it to prisoners, would make prisoners stand in formation for hours in the sun for no reason, would shout at them, mock them, make them do pointless tasks just to humiliate them. I told myself it wasn't that bad. They were the enemy. They'd lost. A little humiliation wasn't the end of the world. But it got worse. Food rations started getting smaller. Prisoners were complaining they weren't getting enough to eat. Medical care became almost non-existent. Guys would get sick and there'd be no treatment, just left in their tents to either recover or die. The latrine situation was terrible. Not enough facilities for 10,000 men. Disease started spreading. Dysentery, typhoid. Prisoners were dying, and nobody seemed to care. I asked one of the senior officers about it. Captain named Morrison, no relation to me. I told him prisoners weren't getting proper rations, that medical care was insufficient, that conditions were violating the Geneva Convention. He looked at me like I was stupid. These are Nazis, Private. Do you know what they did? What we found in those camps? And you're worried about them getting enough food? I said, sir, the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention is for soldiers who followed rules. These bastards forfeited those protections when they built ovens for human beings. As far as I'm concerned, they're lucky we're not doing to them what they did to the Jews. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me understood his anger. I'd seen Niederhausen. I knew what they had done. But another part of me knew this was wrong. You can't claim moral superiority while violating the same principles you say you're fighting for. But I was just a private. What was I going to do?
Then one day I witnessed something that crossed a line I couldn't ignore. There was a prisoner, maybe 40 years old, former Wehrmacht sergeant. He'd gotten dysentery, was very sick, needed medical attention. He approached the fence and called out to one of the guards, asking to see a medic. The guard was a guy from our unit named Patterson, young kid, maybe 22. Patterson walked over to the fence. "What do you want, Kraut?" The German explained in broken English that he was sick, needed help. Patterson laughed, called over 2 other guards. They all started mocking the prisoner, making jokes about him. One of them said, "You know what helps with dysentery? A good beating. Gets everything out of your system." They opened the gate, went into the prisoner section, and they beat him. Right there in front of everyone. Beat him with rifle butts until he was lying in the dirt, bleeding, unable to move. Other prisoners watched, didn't intervene. They knew if they tried to help, they'd get the same treatment. The guards left him there. The German sergeant died 3 days later. No medical care, no investigation. Just another dead prisoner in a camp full of dying men. I reported it, went straight to Captain Morrison, told him what I'd witnessed. He listened to my whole story without interrupting. Then he said, "Did this prisoner attack the guards?" "No, sir. He asked for medical help." "Are you sure? Because Patterson's report says the prisoner became violent, tried to grab a weapon. The guards subdued him using appropriate force." "That's not what happened, sir. I was there." "Were you close enough to hear what was said?" "Not every word, but—" "So you can't be certain the prisoner didn't threaten the guards. You can't be certain he didn't make a move toward their weapons. In a situation like that, guards have to protect themselves. Better to overreact than let a prisoner get a hold of a rifle. Wouldn't you agree?" I realized what was happening. They were going to cover it up, just like they'd been covering up the malnutrition, the lack of medical care, all of it. Because if the truth got out, if anyone investigated and found out what was really happening in these POW camps, there would be consequences, trials, maybe even war crime charges against American soldiers. So the easier solution was to make sure nobody investigated. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not justice." "Justice?" Morrison laughed. "Let me tell you about justice, Private. Justice is those camps we liberated. Justice is the millions of people the Nazis murdered. Justice is making sure these bastards understand they lost. If a few of them don't make it home because we didn't take perfect care of them, well, that's just the cost of losing a war, especially a war they started. You got a problem with that?" I should have said yes. Should have insisted. Should have gone over his head, reported it to someone higher up, made a formal complaint. But I didn't. I was young, tired, disillusioned, and part of me agreed with him. These were Nazis. They'd built camps. They'd killed millions. Why should I risk my career, maybe face retaliation from other soldiers, to protect them? So I stayed quiet, and I watched as conditions in that camp got worse. Watched as more prisoners died from preventable diseases. Watched as guards abused prisoners for entertainment. Watched as we became the thing we said we were fighting against. Not as organized, not as systematic, but the principle was the same. When you have complete power over people you've dehumanized, when you convince yourself they deserve whatever happens to them, you can justify anything. There was one guard, a corporal named Jenkins, who seemed to enjoy it. He'd find excuses to beat prisoners, would deny them water on hot days, would make them do pointless labor until they collapsed. One time I saw him force a prisoner to dig a hole, then fill it in, then dig it again, over and over for 6 hours straight. The prisoner was an old man, maybe 60. He collapsed from exhaustion. Jenkins kicked him and told him to get up. The man couldn't. Jenkins walked away laughing. I went over to help the man, got him some water, helped him back to his tent. He looked at me with these confused eyes, like he couldn't understand why one American was helping him while another had just tortured him for fun. I couldn't understand it either. We'd liberated camps. We'd seen what the Nazis did. We'd sworn we'd never forget. We'd sworn we were better. And 3 months later, we were doing the same things. Maybe not on the same scale, maybe not with the same efficiency, but the same principle, the same dehumanization, the same cruelty. I served at that camp for 4 months. In those 4 months, over 300 prisoners died. Not from combat, not from legitimate causes, from malnutrition, disease, neglect, and abuse. 300 men who'd survived the war, who'd surrendered, who were supposed to be protected under international law. 300 men whose deaths were covered up, explained away, buried in paperwork that made them look like natural casualties of a defeated army. When I finally rotated out, I was relieved. I didn't want to see that place anymore. Didn't want to be part of what was happening there. But leaving didn't erase what I'd witnessed. Didn't erase my complicity, because that's what it was, complicity. I saw crimes being committed, and I did nothing effective to stop them. I made one report that got buried, and then I stopped trying.
I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I was just following orders, that there was nothing I could do. All the same excuses we condemned the Germans for using.
I came home in 1946. Tried to forget about the POW camp. Tried to focus on the good parts of my service. Tried to tell myself that what happened there was an aberration, not representative of America, not representative of who we were. But I couldn't forget. Every time someone thanked me for my service, every time someone talked about how we defeated evil, every time I heard about the Nuremberg trials, where we prosecuted Nazis for war crimes, I thought about that camp. I thought about Captain Morrison and Patterson and Jenkins. I thought about the 300 men who died under American supervision. And I wondered if we had any right to judge anyone. For decades, I didn't tell anyone, didn't talk about it. It was classified anyway. We'd all been told not to discuss conditions in POW camps. National security, protecting the reputation of the military, all the usual justifications for covering up inconvenient truths. And honestly, I was ashamed. Ashamed I'd witnessed it, ashamed I hadn't done more to stop it, ashamed that I'd been part of the good guys turning into the bad guys. Then, in the 1990s, some documents were declassified. Historians started researching American POW camps in occupied Germany, started finding evidence of abuse, malnutrition, high death rates, started interviewing survivors. The truth was coming out. Not the full truth, not the worst details, but enough that people started asking questions, started challenging the narrative that Americans had always treated prisoners humanely, started suggesting that maybe we hadn't been as noble as we claimed. I followed this research closely, read every article, every book, waiting to see if someone would expose the specific camp where I'd served. Part of me hoped they would, hoped someone else would tell the story so I wouldn't have to. But they never did. That camp was mentioned in a few documents, but never investigated deeply. The 300 deaths were attributed to the chaos of the immediate post-war period, natural consequences of a defeated army. Nothing to see here. Move along. So I stayed quiet. Until recently. Until I started telling my war stories and realized I couldn't just share the good parts. Couldn't just tell you about saving Heinrich or being saved by Marie. Had to tell you the whole truth. Had to tell you about Klaus, the 14-year-old I killed, and had to tell you about this, about watching Americans commit the same kinds of cruelty we'd condemned the Nazis for. Because if I don't tell you, if I let people keep believing we were always the good guys, always noble, always better, then I'm still complicit, still part of the cover-up, still protecting a lie. Here's what I need you to understand. The Nazis were evil. What they did in the concentration camps was systematically planned genocide. What happened in the American POW camps wasn't the same scale, wasn't the same level of organization, wasn't the same intent, but the principle underneath was identical. When you dehumanize people,
when you convince yourself they don't deserve basic human rights, when you have complete power over them and no accountability, cruelty becomes easy. Evil becomes normal, and anyone can do it. Americans, Germans, anyone. We weren't born better than the Nazis. We weren't inherently more moral. The only thing that separated us from them was the systems we built, the rules we followed, the lines we refused to cross. But when we abandoned those rules, when we decided the Geneva Convention didn't apply because these were Nazis, when we let guards abuse prisoners without consequences, we became just like them. Maybe not as bad, but the same in principle. And principle is what matters. I've thought a lot about Captain Morrison over the years, about his justification. They built ovens for human beings, so they don't deserve protection. It's a compelling argument, emotionally satisfying, makes you feel righteous, but it's wrong. Because the second you decide some group of people doesn't deserve human rights, you've started down the same path the Nazis took. You've accepted the principle that people can be categorized as less than human, that some lives don't matter, that cruelty is acceptable if directed at the right targets. The Nazis believed Jews, Roma, disabled people, homosexuals, and others weren't fully human, didn't deserve protection, didn't matter. That's how they justified the camps. That's how they justified the ovens. And when we said German prisoners didn't deserve Geneva Convention protections because they were Nazis, we were using the exact same logic. Different targets, different scale, same principle. And that principle is what leads to atrocity. Always. Every time. Without exception. I'm not saying German prisoners deserved sympathy. I'm not saying they were victims. Many of them had committed terrible crimes. Many of them had participated in the Holocaust. They deserved to be tried, convicted, punished according to law. But they didn't deserve to be starved, to be beaten, to be denied medical care, to die from neglect and abuse while in our custody. Because the second we allowed that, we lost our moral authority. We became just another group of people with power, abusing those without it.
After the war, we prosecuted Nazi guards from concentration camps. We said they should have refused orders, should have stood up against injustice, even at personal cost, should have recognized that following orders doesn't excuse participation in evil. We hanged people for less than what I witnessed American soldiers doing in that POW camp. We executed Germans who'd stood by and done nothing while atrocities happened in front of them. And I was one of those bystanders. I stood by. I did nothing. I let it happen. The difference is I was on the winning side. So nobody prosecuted me. Nobody held me accountable. Nobody even investigated. And that's the real lesson here. Evil isn't about nationality. It's about power and what people do with it. It's about systems that enable cruelty and cultures that excuse it. It's about good people staying silent because speaking up is hard, because challenging authority is risky, because it's easier to look away and tell yourself it's not your problem. I looked away. For 4 months, I watched prisoners being abused and did almost nothing to stop it. Made one report that got buried and then gave up. Told myself I was just a private, that I couldn't change anything, that it wasn't as bad as what the Nazis did, so maybe it was acceptable. All lies, all excuses, all the same justifications we condemned others for using. I'm 98 years old. I'll be dead soon. And I need to tell you this truth before I go. We weren't the pure heroes we pretend we were. We did terrible things. Not as systematically terrible as the Nazis, not as organized, not as extensive, but terrible nonetheless. And we covered it up. We classified documents. We buried evidence. We told comfortable lies about American nobility and moral superiority. And people believed those lies because they wanted to, because it feels good to think we're the good guys, that we're incapable of the evil we see in others. But we're not. We're all capable of it. Under the right circumstances, with the right justifications, with enough dehumanization of the enemy, anyone can commit atrocity. Anyone can abuse power. Anyone can become a monster. The only thing that stops us is choosing not to. Choosing to follow rules even when they're inconvenient. Choosing to treat people humanely even when they're enemies. Choosing to speak up even when it's risky. And I didn't make those choices. Not strongly enough, not persistently enough. And 300 men died partly because of that failure. I can't bring them back. Can't undo what happened. Can't make it right. All I can do is tell you the truth. Tell you that liberation of the concentration camps was real. The evil of the Nazi regime was real. But our response wasn't pure. Our hands weren't clean. We did things we shouldn't have done. And then we hid them because acknowledging them would complicate the story we wanted to tell about ourselves. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Never trust anyone who tells you their side is purely good. Never believe anyone who says the enemy deserves whatever happens to them. Never accept the argument that some people don't deserve human rights because of what they've done, because that's how it starts. That's how normal people justify doing terrible things. That's how guards at concentration camps convinced themselves they were just following orders. And that's how American soldiers convinced themselves it was acceptable to abuse German prisoners. The line between civilization and barbarism isn't about nationality. It's not about which flag you fly or which side you're on. It's about the choices you make when you have power over others. It's about whether you maintain your principles when they're inconvenient. It's about whether you speak up when you see wrong being done, even when staying silent would be easier. I failed that test. I saw wrong being done, and I didn't fight hard enough to stop it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm just telling you the truth, that in 1945, American soldiers abused German prisoners, that I witnessed it, that I reported it once and gave up when nothing changed, and that I'm complicit in 300 deaths that should never have happened. And that reality is part of the World War II story that needs to be told. We liberated concentration camps. That's true. We defeated Nazi Germany. That's true. But we also ran POW camps where prisoners were abused and died from neglect. That's also true. And we can't just remember the first part and forget the second. We can't celebrate our nobility while hiding our cruelty. We can't prosecute others for crimes we also committed. Well, we can. We did. But it makes us hypocrites. And hypocrisy like that, buried and unexamined, makes it easier to repeat the same mistakes. I'm 98 years old. I liberated a concentration camp and saw evil beyond description. 3 months later, I watched American soldiers commit a lesser version of that same evil, and I did nothing to stop it. That's my truth. That's my burden. And now it's yours too. Because I've told you. And now you have to decide what to do with it. Whether to accept that our history is more complicated than we pretend. Whether to demand accountability, even for our own side. Whether to insist on principles, even when they protect enemies. That's what separates us from the monsters. Not that we never do wrong, but that we're willing to admit it when we do, willing to face it, willing to do better. I failed at that 80 years ago. I'm trying not to fail now. That's all any of us can do. Tell the truth, face what we've done, and insist on doing better, even when it's hard. Even when it hurts, even when the truth makes us look bad. Because the alternative is becoming what we fought against. And I've seen where that leads. I've seen it from both sides. And I'm telling you, before I die, that the only way to prevent it is truth. Uncomfortable, ugly, complicated truth. About them and about us. Subscribe if you think truth matters more than comfortable lies.